Welcome back to Discourse 1, the ego personality, the one who miscreates. This is session number 5. Hierarchy of ego needs. Returning again to the studies of psychology that articulate the ego program more fully, there is an identifiable hierarchical structure that drives the human experience of a reality inflicted with the illusions of needs. The American psychologist Abraham Maslow in 1943 published the research paper titled A Theory of Human Motivation, which outlined in a simple pyramid the hierarchical structure of human needs that motivate an individual. This pyramid would later be known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's pyramid is significant as it includes the spiritual concept of self-actualization at its peak, which is identical to the concept of at-one-ment, enlightenment, and salvation as discussed throughout this discourse. This hierarchical transcendence from the base physical needs rising to mental or psychological needs and then to spiritual wisdom, where integration is achieved, is also a representation of David R. Hawkins' map of the levels of consciousness as described earlier in this discourse. Maslow's chart describes the movement of the ego's focus of attention from a purely externalized based reality, which is sensory dominated, to one of an internally focused awareness of being. This self-actualized being is the achievement of the body-soul-spirit balance that was mentioned earlier. Maslow's pyramid maps the journey of return for the human entity, where conflict and inner turmoil, which is experienced as suffering, is replaced by peace. Every human ego is ultimately expressing this evolution of consciousness that is mapped within this pyramid. In the ancient mythologies and stories, it was called the hero's journey. This process of transformation from a purely physically sensory-focused ego level of consciousness to Christ consciousness will also reflect the vibrational output or frequency that is being expressed by a human entity. Your personal reality is a manifestation of the vibrational frequency that you are transmitting and experiencing on your screen of reality, an outward projection of an inward condition. Your thoughts create. How this is achieved will be discussed more in the next discourse number 2, You Create Your Reality, the Manifestation of Thought. In his book, Driven, How Human Nature Shapes Our Choices, Harvard business professor Paul R. Lawrence identifies the primary drives underlying human nature. The ego's propensity towards getting, which arises from the illusion of need as mentioned previously, is the number one motivator that drives the program. A day in the life of the ego can basically be described as, it's all about me. The 4 innate drives which propel the ego's focus of selfishness are identified by Lawrence as 1. To acquire, to get. 2. To bond, to connect. 3. To learn, to detect. 4. To defend, to protect. In regards to the concept of acquisition, or the getting principle, Lawrence defines as a drive to seek, take, control, and retain objects and personal experiences humans value. He goes further and explains, humans identify themselves with acquired objects and pleasurable experiences and feel a sense of ownership in this regard. Given the general scarcity of desired objects and experiences, this drive draws humans into competition with other humans. It is usually, but not always, a zero-sum game. This description by Lawrence as a zero-sum game is expanded on further in his book when he states, the drive to acquire is not just immediate and inbuilt, it is insatiable. A drive that was once of primary value for survival purposes has, in the modern era, been surpassed by acquisition for self-identity or inflating the self-concept, which is the symbolic concept of self. The ego relies on external validation by enhancing its value through the procurement of objects and experiences that inflate or aggrandize the sense of identity. This is where the two spiritual concepts of desire and attachment become relevant, as it is the ego's identification with its possessions and the insatiable desire for more, which is the urge to repeat, that are considered the source of misery and suffering. As the ego is focused on an illusory external world of perceptions, it is vulnerable to the fluctuations contained within its worldly experience. What is used as an identity enhancer can also be subject to loss. The external environment has now been perceived with a seeming ability to enhance your ego or deflate it. To be considered nothing or to have nothing is the ego's ultimate nightmare. To be a nobody is to experience a psychological annihilation, and to have nothing is equated to a physical death. The Eastern spiritual master Swami Vivekananda was a leader in teaching the philosophies of spiritual wisdom to Western cultures. In his book Karma Yoga, he issues the warning that it is the ego's selfish identification and subsequent attachment with its possessions that is the source of suffering. This I and mine causes the whole misery. With the sense of possession comes selfishness, and selfishness brings on misery. Every act of selfishness or thought of selfishness makes us attached to something, and immediately we are made slaves. Each wave in the chitta that says I and mine immediately puts a chain around us and makes us slaves. And the more we say I and mine, the more slavery grows, the more misery increases. What is known as needs in the psychological sense is more commonly referred to as desires in the Eastern spiritual teachings. Desires are only an infliction of the ego, not of the spirit, as they are an expression of polarity or duality. The pure mind that is Christ-conscious awareness can only be achieved when desires or needs are no longer present and driving the sensory-enslaved ego. A mind at peace is free from the illusion of need and the encumbrances of insatiable desires. The Chinese master Lao Tzu, in the ancient scripture of the Tao, writes, "A wise man desires nothing, as this is a symbol of a mind united with divinity and no longer delusional." To further expand on this knowledge, we can also use another word to define need and desire, that of temptation. Earlier in this discourse, when discussing the story of the Garden of Eden, the word temptation was understood to mean the electromagnetic polarizing of thoughts as judgments. This polarization then manifests into experiences that may appear and be labeled as good or evil. Hence, to be driven by the illusion of need, desire, or temptation, which are the judgments of the ego body-mind thought system which are polarized, is to be subjected to a reality that experiences good and evil. The unified balance, right-minded thoughts expressed through Christ consciousness is free of polarity and hence evil. The lines contained within the Lord's Prayer, "Lead us not into temptation but deliver us from evil," can now be more clearly understood. The Dictionary of Etymology defines desire as a craving or yearning, an emotion directed toward the attainment or possession of an object, sensual appetite, physical desire, lust, meaning that which is longed for. The use of the words craving, yearning, and longed for associated with this definition of desire contains within it the activity of the electromagnetic forces. Magnets of opposite poles, positive and negative, will feel a compulsion, urge, or craving to unite and attach. When placed in opposition, being negative to negative or positive to positive, then they have a field of force that repels their union. This field of force that surrounds them exerts an effect, but the cause remains invisible to the spectrum of human vision. It is a hidden force. The hidden force lies behind the universal law that is more commonly known as the law of attraction and repulsion. Everything in the universe is seeking to bond, unite, or attach with its opposite, which is electric, or to move away from or be repelled, which is magnetism. This action of desire and repulsion are fundamental to the creative principle contained within the universe. Nothing can be created without it. It is your unawareness of these hidden forces compelling your experience of personal reality that underpin the teachings contained within the Eastern philosophical teachings. Eastern Guru Sri Aurobindo, in his book, The Hidden Forces of Life, states, according to those who can see behind the external appearances of things, mystics, yogis, occultists and the like, the key to such mystery behind the internal as well as external events and vicissitudes of our lives consists in the fact that all life is a play of hidden forces. We live and move in a world of forces of which we are almost totally unaware. From a psychological perspective, you will feel this hidden force as the seeking of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. From a spiritual perspective, it is known as cravings and aversions. The entire philosophy of Buddhism is founded upon knowledge of these hidden forces underpinning the ego's life experience. The Four Noble Truths declare: 1. All existence is dukkha, suffering, anguish or pain. The cause of dukkha is craving. The cessation of dukkha comes with the cessation of craving. This is the path that leads from dukkha. The path that leads from dukkha is also the path that is contained within the teachings of the Tao, which means the way. Until the ego is unified and balanced in mind, free of the polarities expressed as desire, need, or temptations, then you will continue to experience suffering. To now apply your knowledge of the ego's entranced, hypnotized state of being that was discussed earlier, with this new understanding of desire, need, and temptation with its electromagnetic charge, then you will better grasp the concept that the ego is a state of being that is demagnetized. The ego archetype and the Chinese trigram set the blueprint for the ego's vibrational expression that sets the levels of electromagnetic attraction and repulsion. To have an experience that is not your natural, unified and balanced being of Christ consciousness, you are assigned an archetype that creates and manifests a reality that is unbalanced electromagnetically. Craving and desire then arise to pull you back to your original state of union and balance. The ego-body-mind consciousness can be considered a negative polarity, as it is created to be the inverted or opposite consciousness to that of Christ consciousness, Antichrist. This is the experience of lack and scarcity mentioned earlier, as it is disempowered and energy that has been limited. Christ consciousness can be considered to be a positive polarity, which is abundant and unified, the empowered pure being. The Christ consciousness then compels union with it from the negative polarity of the ego, which will be the full expression of its magnetism as an awakened entity. This state of demagnetization that the ego experiences when it is out of balance and entranced by illusion makes the experience of life for a human entity very difficult and hard work. With its focus of attention externalized by projection, the ego can only turn to its environment to seek the abundance that it believes it needs in order to survive. The monetary system that the ego depends upon as a primary mechanism to deliver the resources it believes it needs is created from debt or a negative polarity. Hence, negative is repelled from negative as expressed by the laws of polarity. Money is difficult for the demagnetized ego to attract, and when it does arrive, it promptly departs through repayments and a multitude of expenses. Edmund Shaftesbury, a 20th century author who wrote extensively on the concept of mental magnetism, clearly understood the relationship between mind and matter. Along with many other metaphysical teachers of this era, the knowledge that mind and thought create was a fundamental principle underlying the creative universe. In the opening words of his book, Universal Magnetism, published in 1924, he states, "Magnetism is the most valuable of all studies. In itself, it is the power to influence or control mind and matter." Further in his book, he comments on the relationship between hypnotism and magnetism. Magnetism and hypnotism are opposite ideas and opposite terms, yet most people believe that the person who is magnetized is hypnotized. This is a serious mistake. To magnetize is to make more awake, to attract, charm, enliven, and vitalize. To hypnotize is to make dull, sleepy, repugnant, weak, cataleptic, and dead as far as the natural functions are concerned. One is always grand and noble, the other is always mean and contemptible. A person who is magnetized is made better for it. One who is mesmerized is made worse for it. The human entity with the ego, body, mind consciousness that is demagnetized and hypnotized in a dreaming state, seated with an insatiable desire for material possessions and experiences, is now vulnerable and susceptible to mental conditioning. Much of the psychological research undertaken in the last century has dealt with behavioral psychology, which has revealed how easy the human entity can be trained and manipulated into achieving certain behaviors. Pleasure and pain, or cravings and aversions, which use the body sensations to stimulate rewards or avoid painful sensations, have made you conditioned to behave in a very predictable way. This is the herd mentality that keeps social consciousness in a consensus trance, maintaining the accepted version of reality presented to it. For large corporations who have access to this psychological knowledge, it has been used to manipulate social perceptions and behaviours to drive and stimulate consumerism through marketing and advertising. The urge to continually take possession of objects and accumulate more to add to your self-identity and status forms the basis of a parasitic society where the virus of commercialism eventually devours the host in a mountain of debt. There is a heavy price you pay for remaining a sleeping blind entity. A Course in Miracles refers. Yet you must learn the cost of sleeping and refuse to pay it. Only then will you decide to awaken, and then the real world will spring to your sight, for Christ has never slept. Cravings and aversions. When the ego, body, mind consciousness was inflicted with the first lie that stated, "I am separate," and then projected a body to symbolize this separation, then the concept of time and space also arose. Primal reality does not exist in time and space, as it is eternal. There is the only ever-present moment known as now. As time and space encompass concepts of past and future, the ego is a thought system that is in resistance to now, or what is. It does not allow its focus of attention to reside in the present moment, but instead dwells in the memories of the past, which it wants to recreate or avoid. Alternatively, it reflects on a future that is considered to be a better version than the unsatisfied present moment. The ego, which feels the deep emptiness of the black hole within, experiences states of being that are unfulfilled, unhappy, and incomplete. A deep sense of unworthiness and being unloved are its constant companions, which it finds intolerable. The future is where it focuses to find the specialness and love it covets. Returning again to the symbolism represented in the story of the Garden of Eden, the serpent or snake entwined around the tree of knowledge of good and evil that entices Adam and Eve to eat of the forbidden fruit is symbolic of the emergence of a central nervous system contained within the human entity's spinal column. The central nervous system creates the pathways that carry the electromagnetic currents throughout the body's nerve network and stimulates internal sensations that can be interpreted as painful or negative, or pleasurable, which is positive. With the primary program of surviving as the significant driver, the environment is continually being interpreted by the central nervous system with feedback signaling, I am okay, or I am not okay. The caduceus symbol used predominantly by the medical fraternity is this concept of the central nervous system and its association with the serpent energy that is visually represented. The ego body-mind consciousness becomes bound and limited within the confines of perceptions, totally at the mercy of body sensations. If the body is okay, then I am okay. The guiding rule of the ego program is bound to feelings based in security and comfort for its body. The mind is considered irrelevant until it interferes with what the body craves. Only then is it turned to in an attempt to correct the problem. Your entire reality is constructed around the body being a central figure in the dream. In the text of A Course in Miracles, it is referred to as the hero of the dream. And also, as mentioned earlier in mythology, the hero's journey is also a reference to the ego on a journey of transformation. The body is a central figure in the dreaming of the world. There is no dream without it, nor does it exist without the dream in which it acts as if it were a person to be seen and to be believed. It takes the central place in every dream, which tells the story of how it was made by other bodies, born into the world outside the body, lives a little while and dies, to be united in the dust with other bodies dying like itself. In the brief time allotted it to live, it seeks for other bodies as its friends and enemies. Its safety is its main concern. Its comfort is its guiding rule. It tries to look for pleasure and avoid the things that would be hurtful. Above all, it tries to teach itself its pain and joys are different and can be told apart. In the spiritual context, the central nervous system is controlled as an expression of the chakra systems, which determine the blueprint of the ego's spiritual ascension or rate of awakening. Enlightenment is not experienced as one event from the illusion of I am me to become instantaneously I am one. It is a process. It is this process of transcendence under direction of the chakras that is termed the way or the hero's journey. More will be discussed about the role of chakras in awakening in the Discourse number 3, titled The Great Work. The existence of central nervous system enables nerve impulses to become translated as bodily sensations and emotional reactions. It animates your thoughts. Thoughts can now be emotionally felt and experienced chemically through the endocrine system of glands. You are not just a computer program that translates binary code, but a biochemical computer that is ruled by the chemistry secreted throughout the body. The readout of pain or pleasure is translated from an electromagnetic impulse to become one of chemical expression. This is the role of dopamine, the chemical of pleasure that induces a feeling of reward when expressed and pain when denied. Dopamine is highly addictive and lies behind the ego's drive for more or urge to repeat experiences that generate the same pleasurable feeling. Because it is chemically based, it does not have the ability to maintain a static or absolute state of being, but instead ebbs and flows as a cycle of homeostasis, seeking equilibrium and balance. The ego body mind consciousness that projects a body is maintained through addictions and habits that continuously exert thoughts and behaviors to remain consistent and repeatable over time. The I am ego thought that you have identified with as being who you think you are is really nothing more than a habit or addiction. When an ego enters the phase of spiritual enlightenment, transcendence, or awakening, great suffering is experienced because of this chemical aspect of the ego's identification with itself as I am. Your true identity as a spiritual essence beyond the confines of time and space are not chemical. Therefore, to know thyself as who you truly are involves this addictive nature of the ego's habits to be withdrawn from. This withdrawal from being a chemically dependent entity that is addicted to dopamine will exhibit all of the same traits and pain as that of a drug addict in rehab. This is why it is often called the dark night of the soul. Earlier in this discourse, a roadmap was discussed as to the levels of consciousness that are transcended on the path of enlightenment, as expressed by David R. Hawkins in his book, Transcending Levels of Consciousness, The Stairway to Enlightenment. In the lowest levels of consciousness that are attributes of the ego body mind consciousness, there are expressions of addictive behaviors which are not being satisfied. As the levels of consciousness are transcended by extinguishing the ego's illusory misidentification of its I and that expression, non-chemical dependent beingness naturally emerges. As a psychiatrist, Hawkins' books provides valuable insights into specific behaviors that are associated with each level of consciousness. His section pertaining to desire specifically discusses cravings and aversions that emerge at this level of the ego body mind consciousness that is servicing its addictions. Desire, which is also known as need, getting, and temptation, as discussed earlier, are the drivers behind these cravings and aversions that compel the human entity towards activities that attempt to avoid one state of being and covet the opposite as an ideal. Some of the cravings and aversions as observed by Hawkins are listed here. The attractors or cravings as opposed to the aversions. Special with an aversion of common. Win gain, aversion is lose. Wealth, aversion is poverty. Control, aversion is passive. Get, aversion is lose. Crave, aversion is frustrated. Acquisition, aversion is poverty. Noticed, aversion is ignored. Success, aversion is failure. Fame, aversion is anonymity. Approval, aversion is criticism. Resist, aversion is change. Force, aversion is weakness. Hawkins goes further in his book to provide a very concise assessment of experience when residing in this lower level of ego consciousness where desire is expressed. The basic problem with this level of consciousness is the inner feelings of lack that results in chronic dissatisfaction, feelings of incompletion, and constant seeking behaviors. The vulnerability of the ego's wantingness is its presumption that fulfillment depends on acquisition from external sources. The exaggerated need results in an overestimation of externals and their unrealistic inflation as to importance. Thus, wantingness leads to insatiability, frustration, and anxiety, as well as greed, avarice, and chronic acquisitiveness. If you can fully grasp the implications of what is being stated here, then you will have a deeper understanding of the spiritual texts, both Western and specifically Eastern, that have been written. Desire is the source of all suffering and misery that is experienced within the human journey. As long as you are enslaved and bound by the ego addictions to the sensory stimulation that is chemically induced by dopamine, then you are tethered to the experience of suffering. Returning again to the wisdom of Swami Vivekananda, who quotes a passage from the Bhagavad Gita. The man who has given up all desires, who desires nothing, not even this life, nor freedom, nor gods, nor work, nor anything, then he has become perfectly satisfied. He has no more cravings. He has seen the glory of the self and has found that the world and the gods and heaven are within his own self. Then the gods become no gods, death becomes no death, life becomes no life. Everything has changed. A man is said to be illumined if his will has become firm, if his mind is not disturbed by misery, if he does not desire any happiness, if he is free of all attachment, of all fear, of all anger. Contained within this quote, hidden with the simplistic term satisfied, is a profound hint that points to how the Christ consciousness mind is achieved. Satisfaction is the end of desire, or craving, need, and temptations. When the two poles of polarity, negative and positive, are balanced and in equilibrium, they are considered satisfied, at peace, whole and complete. The swing of the opposites is neutralized and union is expressed. What was two, dual, is now one. What is satisfied is gratified. When desire and need are present and create the urge for more, this is resistance to the present eternal moment of now. This is the natural state of the ego body mind consciousness that judges or polarizes the present moment and lives in the state of seeking but never finding. Union of poles is not contained within the ego consciousness thought stream, which is created to express the opposite, to be in opposition and in resistance, antichrist, negative. The ego is not at peace when in a state of desire or craving. Because the ego body mind consciousness is created in resistance and therefore in lack, it seeks outside of itself for completion and union to end its craving. Cloaked in its heavy veil of ignorance as to the truth that Christ is within, it is seeking where it can never be satisfied, in the illusion or the dream that seems to appear outside as a projection. A Course in Miracles provides guidance. No one who comes here must still have hope, some lingering illusion of some dream that there is something outside of himself that will bring happiness and peace to him. If everything is in him, this cannot be so, and therefore by his coming he denies the truth about himself and seeks for something more than everything, as if a part of it were separated off and found where all the rest of it is not. This is the purpose he bestows upon the body, that it seek for what he lacks and give him what would make himself complete. And thus he wanders aimlessly about in search of something that he cannot find, believing that he is what he is not. The ego, when seeking satisfactions of its desires outside of itself, projects a sense of specialness or value onto perceived objects and people. It then attaches and clings to this inflated version and attempts to protect and defend it from loss. This constant searching and seeking to satisfy desires and then creating attachments to perceived objects or people that have been deemed able to satisfy those desires sets the ego up for a life that is filled with anxiety, fear, and stress. Fear is experienced when you believe that you may not get what you want, or alternatively that you may lose what you have attached to. It is this resistance which causes fear. Spiritual master Eckhart Tolle, in his book The New Earth, shares the Eastern philosophical wisdom that understands this state of resistance as one of the significant drivers of suffering in a human entity. Resistance makes the world and things of the world appear more real, more solid, and more lasting than they are, including your own form, identity, the ego. It endows the world and the ego with a heaviness and an absolute importance that makes you take yourself and the world very seriously. The play of form is then misperceived as a struggle for survival, and when that is your perception, it becomes your reality. When the ego submitted to the first thought, I am separate, it was forever condemned to a fruitless search outside of itself for a completion or union that never existed. Conditions were now placed on people, places, things, and events to meet the requirements of complete me, make me happy, love me. Acceptance of what is became impossible, as it reflected back everything that you did not want and instead propelled you in search of something better. A Course in Miracles reflects on this search outside. Seek not outside yourself, for all your pain comes simply from a futile search for what you want, insisting where it must be found. What if it is not there? Do you prefer that you be right or happy? Be glad that you are told where happiness abides, and seek no longer elsewhere. You will fail, but it is given you to know the truth and not to seek for it outside yourself. When living with conditions placed on the external environment that is assigned with the responsibility to chemically bring me pleasure, then the ego as an effect is totally at the mercy of its own projection. This condition has a name: victim. The ego has a role for everyone to play in this demand for meeting its addictions, and when those conditions are not met, there is always someone to blame and hold responsible for its misery and suffering. Look how poorly I've been treated is a theme that runs constantly through the ego individual program as well as the social consciousness network. Those ego states of being that include sensations of jealousy, envy, bitterness, revenge, vindictiveness, retribution, attack, deprivation, betrayal, abandonment, rejection, dependency, and hatred can all be associated with the victim program of poor me. This is the disempowered state of being that emerges when the ego projects an external world and now must seek power outside of itself. The game of life is played in this arena of control dramas, where you either give up your own power to someone or something else, or you seek to obtain someone else's power by tapping into their energy field by pity, aloofness, ego stroking, and a multitude of other strategies. When the ego body mind consciousness became the veil to primal reality, truth, and love, then it became a conditioned, chemically dependent, bipolar thought that is not truly loving, as hate arises on the same spectrum. The love of infinite intelligence, the divine, all that is, God, whatever name you prefer, is not chemical and not conditional. This is how you will know the truth. If your version of a loving God includes acts of judgment, condemnation, sacrifice, punishment, unforgiveness, spite, vengefulness, or any term such as these, then that is an ego version of God. The love that is infinite intelligence does not have conditions because it is just and in equilibrium, pure awareness without desire or need. Only the ego conditional love is dependent on needs because your personality is chemical. This now concludes session number 5 of Discourse number 1, the ego personality, the one who miscreates. I'll put a link in the description box below for the next session being number 6. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much for your attendance during this session. So be it.